The rain had started as a whisper during Grace's lunch break, but by 3 o'clock it was hammering against the classroom windows like an insistent visitor demanding entry. Grace Chen stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand, watching her third graders pack their backpacks with the chaotic energy that always preceded dismissal. At 7 months pregnant, even this simple act of supervising felt exhausting. "Miss Chen, is it gonna flood?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, his brown eyes wide with concern as he pressed his face against the window. Grace smiled, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. "No, sweetheart. It's just a storm. Your parents will be here soon to pick you up." But even as she said it, her phone buzzed with an emergency weather alert. Severe thunderstorms. Flash flooding expected. The city's aging infrastructure was notoriously vulnerable to heavy rain, and the forecast predicted this would be one of the worst storms of the year. By the time the last child was picked up and Grace finished her end-of-day paperwork, it was nearly 6 p.m. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it had intensified. The sky outside had turned an ominous shade of charcoal, and the streetlights flickered on early, casting wavering reflections in the growing puddles. Grace's apartment in Queens was only accessible by subway. She'd sold her car when she moved to New York 3 months ago, fleeing her old life in Ohio with nothing but 2 suitcases and a desperate need to disappear. The money from the car had covered her security deposit and first month's rent. Now she relied on the subway like millions of other New Yorkers. She gathered her worn leather bag, checked that her phone was charged, 72%, good enough, and pulled on her raincoat. The fabric stretched awkwardly over her pregnant belly, but it would have to do. Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped out into the deluge. The water was already ankle-deep on the sidewalks. Grace walked carefully, one hand on her belly, the other clutching her bag. Other commuters rushed past her, their faces hidden beneath umbrellas and hoods, everyone desperate to get home before things got worse. The baby shifted inside her, a rolling movement that made Grace pause and breathe through the discomfort. "Almost home, little one," she whispered. "Just hang on." The entrance to the Times Square 42nd Street station was packed with people funneling down the stairs, a river of humanity escaping the storm. Grace joined the flow, relieved to be out of the rain even as the crowd pressed around her. The subway station smelled like wet wool, coffee, and the particular metallic scent of underground New York. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the familiar rumble of trains echoed through the tunnels. Grace made her way to the platform for the 7 train, her usual route home. The electronic board showed her train arriving in 4 minutes. She found a spot near a support column, away from the platform edge, and tried to ignore the water dripping from her coat onto the concrete floor. That's when she noticed him. He stood about 20 feet away near the far end of the platform, and he was completely different from everyone around him. While other commuters were disheveled from the rain, checking their phones anxiously or chatting with companions, this man stood perfectly still. He wore an expensive charcoal suit that somehow hadn't been touched by the storm, and his dark hair was styled with precision. He looked to be in his mid-40s with sharp features and an expression that revealed nothing. What struck Grace most was his stillness. In a station full of nervous energy and movement, he was an island of calm. His dark eyes scanned the platform methodically, the way someone might survey a room they were considering purchasing. There was something calculated about him, something that made Grace's instincts prickle with unease. She looked away quickly, not wanting to be caught staring. Her therapist back in Ohio had warned her about this, the hypervigilance that came from surviving what she'd survived. Not every man was a threat. Not every moment of discomfort was danger. Sometimes a person was just a person, and her racing heart was just her trauma talking. The loudspeaker crackled to life, and a distorted voice announced that all trains were experiencing delays due to weather conditions. A collective groan rippled through the crowd. Grace checked her phone again, now down to 68%. She texted her friend Maya, stuck at Times Square station. "Trains delayed. I'm okay." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then Maya's response, "Be careful. News says flooding is getting bad. Call me when you're home safe." Grace was typing a reply when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then a prolonged moment of darkness that made several people gasp. When the lights came back on, they were dimmer and a different tone hummed through the air. Emergency power, Grace realized. The loudspeaker crackled again, but this time the voice was clearer, more urgent. "Attention all passengers. Due to severe flooding in multiple tunnels, all train service is being suspended immediately. Please proceed to the nearest exit in an orderly fashion. This station will be closing in 10 minutes. All passengers must evacuate." This is not a drill. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. People surged toward the stairs, a stampede of panic that made Grace's heart leap into her throat. She pressed herself against the support column, trying to stay out of the way as hundreds of bodies pushed past her. Someone's bag hit her shoulder. An elbow grazed her back. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the jostling. Grace waited for the initial rush to pass, knowing that trying to climb those stairs in the middle of a panicking crowd while 7 months pregnant was asking for disaster. She'd wait, let most people clear out, then make her way up slowly and carefully. As the platform emptied, Grace noticed the man in the charcoal suit hadn't moved. He was still standing in his spot, but now he was watching her. Their eyes met across the thinning crowd, and Grace felt that prickle of unease again. Why wasn't he leaving? She decided to head for the stairs anyway. Better to be in the crowd than alone with a stranger who stared. Grace pushed off from the column and started walking, but she'd only taken a few steps when she heard it. A sound like thunder, but wrong, coming from below instead of above. The platform shuddered slightly beneath her feet. Then she saw it. Water, rushing down the stairs she'd been about to climb. Not a trickle, but a surge. Brown and angry, carrying debris and trash in its wake. The people still on the stairs screamed and scrambled back down, soaking wet and terrified. "The tunnels are flooding," someone yelled. "The exits are blocked." More water began pouring down the other staircases. Grace watched in horror as the station transformed into a trap. The water on the platform was already covering her shoes, cold and filthy. People were running in different directions now, some trying other exits, others heading deeper into the station complex, looking for alternative routes. Grace's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She needed to call someone, needed help, but who? The emergency line would be overwhelmed. Maya couldn't help from Queens. Grace felt tears burning in her eyes as the reality of her situation crashed over her like the water pouring down the stairs. "Miss," a voice, low and calm, spoke near her shoulder. "You need to move, this platform will flood." Grace turned and found herself face to face with the man in the charcoal suit. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and they held an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly reassuring. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and carried himself with a controlled grace that suggested he'd be dangerous if he chose to be. But his voice, when he spoke again, was gentle. "I know a way deeper into the station. Maintenance areas. They'll be higher, safer. Come with me." Every instinct Grace had learned from her therapist screamed at her not to follow a strange man anywhere, especially into the depths of a flooding subway station. But as she looked around, she saw that the water was rising faster now, already past her ankles. The few people still on the platform were panicking, and one elderly woman had fallen, struggling to get up in the rushing water. The man in the suit moved immediately, pulling the woman to her feet with surprising gentleness. "Ma'am, there's an exit through the service corridor. Can you walk?" The woman nodded, clutching his arm. He turned to Grace. "Are you coming?" Grace made a split-second decision based purely on gut instinct. This man, whoever he was, wasn't going to hurt her. There was something in his eyes behind the intensity, a weariness, maybe even kindness. And right now her options were follow him or stay here and hope the water stopped rising. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming." He nodded once, then turned and began walking with the elderly woman toward the far end of the platform. Grace followed, the water now mid-calf and rising. Her sneakers were completely soaked, and each step was an effort. The baby seemed to sense her stress, moving restlessly inside her. They reached a door marked, "Authorized personnel only," just as another surge of water came pouring down the main stairs. The man produced what looked like a maintenance card from his pocket. Where had he gotten that? And swiped it through the reader. The light turned green and he pulled the door open. "Quickly," he said, ushering the elderly woman through first, then Grace. He followed and pulled the door shut behind them, muting the sound of rushing water and screaming people. They were in a concrete corridor lit by dim emergency lights. It was quieter here, but not silent. Grace could hear water moving somewhere below them, and the whole building seemed to groan under the strain of the storm. The corridor sloped upward, away from the platform level. "This way," the man said, leading them higher. The elderly woman was breathing hard, and Grace wasn't much better. Her back ached from the baby's weight, and her heart was racing. They climbed a metal staircase to another level, then another, until they finally reached a door labeled Station Operations Office. The man tried his card again. It worked. Inside was a small office space that looked like it hadn't been used in months. There were old desks covered in dust, filing cabinets, a coffee maker that probably didn't work, and blessed relief, the floor was completely dry. The elderly woman sank into a desk chair immediately. "Thank you," she gasped. "Thank you so much. Is there another way out from here?" Grace asked, looking around hopefully. The man shook his head. "All the exits connect to the main corridors, which are flooding. We'll need to wait until the water recedes or rescue teams can reach us, but we're safe here. This level is well above the flood zone." He pulled out his phone, checked it, frowned. No signal. The cell towers are probably overloaded, or the flooding damaged something. Grace checked her own phone. 60% battery. No signal. She felt a flutter of panic but pushed it down. Panic wouldn't help. She looked at the man who'd saved her, and the elderly woman, trying to see past his expensive suit and composed expression. "Thank you for helping us," Grace said. "I'm Grace. Grace Chen." He hesitated for just a moment before responding. "Dominic, do you work here?" Grace asked. "How did you have that access card?" Another hesitation. "I used to do some consulting work for the city. Transportation infrastructure. They never asked for the card back." It wasn't quite a lie, Grace thought, but it wasn't quite the truth either. There was something he wasn't saying. But then again, she had her own secrets. Who was she to judge? The elderly woman introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, and after drinking some water from a bottle Dominic found in one of the desks, she said she was going to try to rest. There was a small break room attached to the office with a couch, and she disappeared inside, leaving Grace and Dominic alone in the main office. Grace stood by the window, though it looked out only on another section of the underground station, and tried to process what had just happened. Outside this room, the subway station was flooding. She was trapped underground with a stranger. She was 7 months pregnant, and her phone had no signal. "Sit down," Dominic said, pulling out a chair for her. "You need to rest. Stress isn't good for the baby." Grace wanted to refuse, to maintain some semblance of independence, but her back was screaming and her feet were swollen. She sat gratefully. Dominic remained standing, and she noticed how he positioned himself near the door, alert and watchful. "You're used to taking care of people," Grace observed. Something flickered across Dominic's face. Surprise, maybe. Or pain. "I suppose I am. Family business?" Something like that. They fell into silence, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Grace found herself studying him. Despite his expensive suit and controlled manner, there was a heaviness about him, a sadness in the set of his shoulders. He looked like a man carrying the weight of difficult choices. Her phone buzzed suddenly. A text had somehow gotten through. It was from Maya. "News says subway flooding is catastrophic. Are you okay? Call me." Before Grace could respond, the signal dropped again. She tried calling, but nothing went through. 60% battery, and the phone was useless. "We should conserve our phone batteries," Dominic said, as if reading her mind. "We might need them later." Grace nodded and turned her phone to low power mode. Outside, she could hear the muffled sound of water still moving through the station. How long would they be trapped here? Hours? All night? The baby kicked hard and Grace winced. Dominic noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" "Just the baby. She's active tonight." "She?" Grace smiled despite everything. "I think so. I didn't want to find out officially, but I have a feeling." Dominic's expression softened slightly. "My daughter was the same way. Very active before she was born. Always moving, always exploring, even in the womb." Grace caught the past tense. "Was?" The softness vanished, replaced by that careful blankness. It was a long time ago. Grace wanted to ask more, but the pain in his voice made her hold back. They'd just met. She had no right to his grief, just as he had no right to her secrets. Thunder rumbled somewhere above them, reminding Grace that the storm was still raging. She pulled her damp coat tighter around herself and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. She tried not to think about being trapped, about the water rising, about what would happen if something went wrong with the baby down here. "We'll be okay," Dominic said quietly, and somehow, coming from him, it sounded like a promise rather than empty reassurance. Grace met his eyes and saw something there that surprised her. Genuine concern, and beneath it a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with what she represented. Someone vulnerable who needed help. "Thank you," Grace said, "for getting us out of there, for bringing us somewhere safe." Dominic nodded once, then turned his attention back to the door. back to his silent vigil. And Grace, exhausted from the day and the stress and the weight of carrying new life, found herself beginning to trust this stranger with the sad eyes and the expensive suit. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, in a forgotten office deep beneath the city, two people who should never have met settled in to wait for morning, neither of them knowing that this unexpected night would change both their lives forever. The water continued to rise in the tunnels below. But here, in this small, dry sanctuary, Grace allowed herself to breathe, to rest, and to hope that when dawn came, they would both make it out safely. And maybe, just maybe, neither of them would be quite the same person they were before. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the abandoned office, creating a strange twilight world that felt disconnected from reality. Grace checked her phone again, 11:47 p.m., and still no signal. They'd been trapped for nearly 6 hours now. Mrs. Patterson had fallen asleep in the break room, her gentle snoring a oddly comforting sound in the eerie silence. Grace shifted in her chair, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache. The baby had finally settled down after an hour of what felt like gymnastics. But Grace's discomfort remained. She was hungry, thirsty, and desperately needed to use a bathroom. Thankfully, the office had a small restroom that still had running water. Dominic hadn't sat down once. He remained near the door, occasionally checking the hallway, listening to the sounds of water moving through the station below. His suit jacket hung on a chair now, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Even in this disheveled state, he maintained an air of controlled composure that Grace found both impressive and slightly unnerving. "You should rest," Grace said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the past hour. "You've been standing this whole time." Dominic glanced at her, and in the dim light his face looked younger, less guarded. "I'm fine. I'm used to long nights." "What kind of work keeps you up all night?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Import and export business, different time zones, you know. Deals happen when they happen, not always during business hours." It was a reasonable answer, delivered smoothly, but something about it felt rehearsed. Grace had become good at detecting lies. She'd had to be, living with Jake for 3 years. She'd learned to read the tiny tells, the fractional pause before speaking, the way eyes would shift just slightly to the left, the careful neutrality of tone that tried too hard to sound casual. "Must be stressful," Grace said, deciding not to push. They were stuck together for the foreseeable future. Interrogating him wouldn't help anything. "It has its moments," Dominic admitted. He finally moved from his post by the door, walking to one of the old desks and leaning against it. "What about teaching? That must have its own stress." Grace smiled. 8-year-olds are a special kind of chaos, but I love it. They're honest, you know. They haven't learned to hide what they feel yet. If they're happy, you know it. If they're upset, you know it. There's something refreshing about that." "You haven't been teaching long," Dominic observed. It wasn't a question. Grace tilted her head. "How did you know?" "The way you talk about it. There's still excitement there. Newness. My daughter wanted to be a teacher once." He stopped abruptly, as if surprised he'd revealed that much. Grace waited, sensing there was more. When Dominic didn't continue, she asked gently, "What happened to her?" The silence stretched so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "She died. 16 years ago. She was 12. Grace's hand went to her chest. "I'm so sorry." Dominic nodded, his jaw tight. "It was an accident. Wrong place, wrong time. She was just collateral damage." The phrase struck Grace as odd. Collateral damage. It was military terminology, or something you'd hear on a crime show. Not how most parents would describe losing a child in an accident. But the pain in his voice was real, raw even after all these years. "Her name was Sophia," Dominic continued, his voice softening. "Sophia Maria Russo. She loved to read, wanted to save every stray animal she found. She made me promise once that I'd be a better man. I was too busy then to understand what she meant." Grace felt tears burning in her eyes. "She sounds wonderful." She was. She was everything good in my life. Dominic looked at Grace then, really looked at her, and she saw the full weight of his grief and regret. "Don't waste time with your daughter, Grace. Whatever else is happening in your life, whatever problems you're facing, she needs to be your priority. Always." "She is," Grace said firmly. "That's why I'm here. That's why I left everything behind." It was more than she'd meant to say, and Dominic picked up on it immediately. "You're running from something." Grace's defenses went up instantly. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. You're alone, 7 months pregnant in a new city. No wedding ring. No one to call when you're trapped in a subway station. You said you left everything behind. People don't do that unless they're running from something. Grace stood up, her heart racing. You don't know anything about me. You're right, I don't. Dominic's voice remained calm, non-threatening. And I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm just saying, I recognize someone trying to start over. I respect it. The tension in Grace's shoulders eased slightly. She sat back down, one hand on her belly. His name was Jake, the baby's father. We were together 3 years. He was controlling. Then the controlling became pushing. Then the pushing became worse. She'd never said it out loud quite so plainly before. Even with her therapist, she'd danced around the words, used euphemisms. But here, in this strange, suspended reality beneath the city, with a man she'd never see again after tonight, the truth came easier. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't raise a child in that environment. So I took money from our joint account, money I'd earned, bought a bus ticket and came here. New York seemed big enough to disappear in. Dominic listened without interrupting, without judgment. When she finished, he simply said, "That took courage. It took desperation." Grace corrected. I was terrified. I'm still terrified. What if he finds me? What if I can't do this alone? What if I'm not a good mother? You'll be a good mother, Dominic said with certainty. You already are. You protected your child when she was still just a possibility. You walked away from everything familiar to give her a better life. That's what parents do. We sacrifice for our children. Grace wiped her eyes. Did you? Sacrifice for Sophia? Dominic's expression darkened. Not enough. Not when it mattered. He pushed off from the desk and walked to the window overlooking the dark station corridor. I was building something, always working, always making deals. I told myself I was providing for my family, but really, I was building an empire. And empires require sacrifices. What kind of empire? Grace asked carefully. Dominic turned to look at her, and for a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "The kind that destroys everything you love if you're not careful. The kind that takes your daughter to school one morning and never brings her back because someone wanted to send you a message." Grace's breath caught. She was killed? Because of you? Because of what I do? What I did? Dominic's voice was hollow. She was 12 years old and she died because I made enemies. Because I thought I was untouchable. Because I was arrogant and stupid. The office felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Grace's instincts screamed at her to be afraid, to put distance between herself and this man who was clearly involved in something criminal. But she also saw his pain, genuine and deep, and she understood that whatever he'd done, he'd paid for it in the worst way possible. "Is that why you're trying to leave?" Grace asked. "The import-export business?" Dominic laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Yes. I'm trying to leave. Tonight was supposed to be a final meeting. A way to close the door on that part of my life, but the storm had other ideas." "Do they let people leave? Your business associates?" "No," Dominic said simply. "They don't. Which is why I've been planning my exit very carefully for the past 2 years." Grace processed this information, trying to reconcile the man standing before her with her imagination of what a criminal might be. He seemed more like a businessman, tired and worn down by years of decisions he regretted. But she also remembered the way he'd moved through the flooding station, the access card he shouldn't have had, the air of authority that people naturally responded to. "You're not afraid of me," Dominic observed. "Should I be?" "Probably. I'm not a good man, Grace. I've done things that would horrify you." "Have you hurt children?" Grace asked directly. "Never. God, never." "Have you hurt women?" "Not in the way you mean." "I've never..." He struggled with the words. "I've never raised my hand to a woman. That's a line I never crossed." Grace nodded slowly. "Then you're already better than my ex-boyfriend." They looked at each other across the small office, two damaged people recognizing something in each other. Grace saw a man drowning in regret, trying to grab onto something good before it was too late. And Dominic saw a woman who'd been brave enough to save herself and her child, who was stronger than she knew. "I have food," Dominic said suddenly, breaking the moment. He reached for his suit jacket and pulled out a wrapped sandwich from the inner pocket. "I was supposed to have lunch at my desk but never got around to it. Italian deli, prosciutto, mozzarella, basil. It's probably still good. You should eat. The baby needs it." Grace's stomach growled audibly at the mention of food. She'd skipped lunch, and breakfast felt like a lifetime ago. "I can't take your food." "Yes, you can. I'm not hungry." He unwrapped the sandwich and set it on the desk between them. Please, it'll go to waste otherwise. Grace gave in, too hungry to be polite. The sandwich was delicious. Expensive ingredients from one of those Italian delis that charge $20 for a sandwich. As she ate, she noticed Dominic watching her with something like satisfaction, as if feeding her was some small way of doing something good. When I was pregnant with, Grace paused, realizing she hadn't chosen a name yet. When I was pregnant, I had the strangest cravings. Pickles and ice cream, of course, but also these really specific things. Like I once drove 40 minutes for a particular brand of orange juice that I suddenly needed immediately. Dominic's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Sophia's mother craved mangoes. We lived in Brooklyn, and she sent me all over the city looking for the perfect mangoes. Had to be exactly ripe, exactly the right color. Did you find them? Every time. Whatever she needed, I found it. His almost smile faded. That was before things got complicated, before I let my business consume everything. Grace finished the sandwich, grateful for the food and the conversation. Outside, the storm seemed to have quieted somewhat, though they could still hear water moving through the station. She checked her phone again. 12:31 a.m., 42% battery, still no signal. We should try to sleep, Dominic said. It could be hours before rescue crews can reach us. I don't think I can sleep, Grace admitted. Too much adrenaline, plus the baby decided to wake up again. As if on cue, a strong kick pressed against Grace's ribs. She winced and rubbed the spot. Dominic noticed immediately. Is that normal? Completely normal. She's just reminding me she's here like I could forget. Grace smiled despite her discomfort. Do you want to feel? The question surprised both of them. Grace wasn't sure why she'd offered. She barely knew this man. But something about the way he'd spoken of Sophia, the way his face softened when he talked about his daughter, made her want to share this moment with someone who understood the miracle of life. Dominic hesitated, clearly torn. I shouldn't. It's okay, Grace said gently. Really. Slowly, carefully, Dominic crossed the space between them. He knelt beside her chair, and Grace took his hand, noting the calluses, the strength in his fingers, and placed it on the side of her belly where the baby was most active. They waited. 1 second, 2, 3, and then the baby kicked. A solid thump against Dominic's palm. His eyes widened with wonder, and Grace saw his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. Tears gathered in his eyes, and he didn't bother to hide them. She's strong, he whispered. She is, Grace agreed. She's a fighter. Dominic kept his hand there for another moment, and Grace saw him transported to another time, another life where he'd felt his own daughter move inside her mother. The grief and longing on his face were so profound that Grace felt tears in her own eyes. When he finally pulled his hand away, he stood quickly and turned his back to her, composing himself. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. Thank you. You're welcome. They didn't speak for a while after that. Dominic returned to his post by the door, but something had shifted between them. The wariness had softened into something else. Not quite trust, but mutual understanding. They were both carrying wounds, both trying to survive in their own ways. Around 1 a.m, Grace finally dozed off in her chair, exhausted beyond the point where discomfort mattered. She didn't know that Dominic watched over her through the night, or that he made a silent promise to the universe that if they made it out safely, he would find a way to help her, to make sure she and her baby had what they needed. She didn't know that in the morning everything would change when men from his world came looking for him in the flooded station. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Grace slept while Dominic kept watch, and somewhere in the darkness above them, the storm began to break. Grace woke with a start, her heart pounding before she even opened her eyes. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The chair beneath her, the musty smell of old paper, the dim emergency lighting. Then it all came rushing back. The flood, the subway station, Dominic. She sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it as a sharp pain shot through her lower back. The baby shifted, pressing uncomfortably against her bladder. Grace checked her phone. 3:47 a.m., 31% battery. Still no signal. They'd been trapped for almost 10 hours. Dominic was still awake, still standing near the door like a sentinel, but now he was closer to the window that overlooked the corridor, his posture tense. He turned when he heard her move. Did you sleep at all? Grace asked, her voice hoarse. I don't need much sleep, he replied, which wasn't really an answer. Grace stood carefully, one hand supporting her belly. and made her way to the small bathroom. When she returned, she found Dominic had moved one of the desk chairs closer to hers, a peace offering of sorts. He'd also found several bottles of water in a small refrigerator in the break room, and had set one on the desk for her. "Thank you," she said, gratefully opening the water and drinking deeply. The storm outside had quieted significantly. Through the walls, they could still hear water moving, but it sounded slower now, less aggressive. Grace wondered if the flooding had peaked, if rescue crews would be able to reach them soon. She wondered what Mrs. Patterson was doing. The elderly woman had been asleep for hours, which was probably for the best. "I had a nightmare," Grace said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "About Jake. About him finding me." Dominic turned from the window, his full attention on her now. "Tell me." Grace wasn't sure why she wanted to talk about it, but something about the deep night hours and this strange intimacy made her continue. "In the dream, I was in my apartment holding the baby. She was already born, perfect and beautiful. And then Jake was just there, in the doorway. He had this look on his face, not angry exactly, but possessive, like I was something he owned that had been stolen from him." She wrapped her arms around herself, remembering the cold fear that had permeated the dream. He said, "You can't run from me, Grace. You're mine. The baby is mine." And I knew in the dream that he was right, that no matter how far I ran, he would always find me. "He's not right," Dominic said firmly. "You're not his. The baby isn't his. Biology doesn't give him ownership over either of you. The law might disagree. He's her father. He could fight for custody. He could—" "Did he hurt you?" Dominic interrupted. His voice had taken on a hard edge that Grace hadn't heard before. "Physically, I mean." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Not at first. At first it was just words, you know? Comments about what I wore, who I talked to, how I spent my time. Then it was controlling the money, isolating me from my friends. Then one night we had an argument about something stupid. I can't even remember what, and he pushed me. I fell against the kitchen counter, bruised my ribs." Her voice was steady as she spoke, clinical almost, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "He apologized, of course, cried, said he'd never do it again. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Because leaving meant admitting I'd made a mistake, that I'd wasted 3 years of my life with someone who didn't really love me. It wasn't your fault," Dominic said. "I know that. Intellectually, I know that. My therapist made sure I understood that. But there's this voice in my head that still says I should have left sooner, should have seen the signs, should have been smarter. We all have voices like that," Dominic said quietly. "Voices that tell us about all the ways we failed, all the choices we should have made differently. I hear my daughter's voice sometimes, asking me why I wasn't there, why I didn't protect her." Grace looked at him in the dim light, seeing the weight he carried. "That wasn't your fault either, wasn't it? I knew the risks. I knew the kind of people I was dealing with, but I thought I was careful enough, smart enough. I thought I could keep my family separate from my work." His hands clenched into fists. "I was wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, two people haunted by different ghosts. Grace's baby kicked again, a reminder of life and hope despite everything. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the movement. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said carefully. "And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Dominic nodded. "What exactly do you do? I mean, I know you said import-export, but—" Grace trailed off, not sure how to phrase it delicately. Dominic was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to sit in the chair he'd positioned near hers. Up close, in the emergency lighting, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the weariness that went bone deep. "My family came to New York from Sicily 3 generations ago," he began. "They started with a restaurant in Little Italy, worked hard, built something legitimate. But my grandfather, he got involved with certain people, made connections that were profitable but complicated. By the time my father took over, the restaurant was just a front. The real business was logistics, moving things that people needed moved, no questions asked." Grace understood what he wasn't saying. "You're in the mob." The word hung in the air between them. Dominic didn't confirm or deny it, but he didn't have to. Grace felt her heart rate pick up, that old instinct to run, to protect herself. But she also noticed that Dominic made no move toward her, didn't try to intimidate or threaten. He simply sat there watching her process this information. "Are you going to hurt me?" Grace asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "No." The answer was immediate and absolute. "Grace, I swear to you on Sophia's memory, I would never hurt you or your baby. Never. Grace believed him. She wasn't sure why, but she did. Maybe it was the way he'd helped Mrs. Patterson, the way he'd shared his food, the way his eyes had filled with wonder when he felt the baby kick. Or maybe it was simply that her instincts, which had failed her so badly with Jake, were finally working again. "Why are you trying to leave?" she asked. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the ceiling. "Because I'm tired. Because every time I close my eyes I see Sophia's face. Because I've spent 16 years doing things that would make my daughter ashamed of me, and I can't do it anymore." "What were you doing tonight? Before the flood?" "I was supposed to meet with the head of the organization. My uncle, actually. I was going to tell him I want out, that I've cooperated with federal investigators and given them enough information to bring down half the operation." Grace's eyes widened. "You're working with the FBI?" "For the past 2 years. Carefully, quietly. They've promised me witness protection, a new identity, a chance to start over." He laughed bitterly. "If my uncle finds out what I've done before I can disappear, I'm a dead man." The casual way he said it sent chills down Grace's spine. This was real. Not a movie, not a story. Real danger, real consequences. And she was trapped in a subway station with a man who was betraying one of the most dangerous organizations in the country. "Why are you telling me this?" Grace asked. "Isn't it dangerous for me to know?" "Probably. But after tonight I'll be gone. Disappeared into witness protection. And you'll go back to your life, have your baby, be safe. Our paths were never meant to cross, Grace. This is just a moment out of time. A strange gift from the universe." "Some gift," Grace said, but there was no real bitterness in her voice. "Actually, it is," Dominic said, turning to look at her directly. "I was supposed to walk into that meeting tonight knowing there was a good chance I wouldn't walk out. The FBI had a team ready to extract me if things went wrong, but it was still a risk, and I was ready to take it because I had nothing to lose, no one to live for." He gestured toward her belly. "And then the storm came, and I ended up here with you, with a woman who's brave enough to leave everything behind for her child, who reminded me what it means to hope for something better. You gave me a reason to want to survive this, Grace, to want to make it to witness protection and actually try to build a new life instead of just hiding until they find me." Grace felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. "I didn't do anything. You let me feel your baby kick. You shared your story with me. You treated me like a person instead of a monster, even though I've done monstrous things. That's not nothing." Grace wiped her eyes, then reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm, strong, and they wrapped around hers with surprising gentleness. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both running from our pasts, both hoping for a better future." "Quite a pair," Dominic agreed. They sat like that for a while, hands linked, drawing strength from each other. Grace found herself thinking about her therapist's words. Sometimes the universe puts people in our path exactly when we need them. She'd always thought that was hokey, the kind of thing people said to make random events feel meaningful, but maybe there was something to it. Maybe meeting Dominic tonight wasn't random at all. "What will you do?" Grace asked. "After witness protection, I mean. What kind of life do you want?" Dominic considered this. "Something quiet, something honest. Maybe I'll work with kids, help them avoid the mistakes I made. I've thought about teaching, not in schools, but in community centers, mentoring programs. Kids who are at risk of getting involved in the life I'm leaving behind." "That would be perfect," Grace said. "You'd be good at it. What about you? What do you want? Besides raising your daughter, I mean." Grace thought about this. She'd been so focused on survival, leaving Jake, finding an apartment, getting a job, preparing for the baby, that she hadn't let herself dream beyond the immediate needs. "I want to finish my master's degree," she said slowly. "I was halfway through when I met Jake and I dropped out. I want to go back, become a reading specialist, help kids who struggle with literacy." "You will," Dominic said with certainty. "You're strong enough to make it happen." "How do you know?" "Because you're here. Because you didn't let your fear stop you from building a new life. Because when the subway was flooding and everyone was panicking, you kept your head. You're stronger than you think, Grace." Grace squeezed his hand, grateful for his faith in her even if she wasn't sure she deserved it. The baby kicked again, seemingly in agreement, and both of them smiled. "She's going to be remarkable," Dominic said. "Your daughter. She has a remarkable mother." "I hope so. I hope I'm enough for her." "You will be. And when she's old enough to understand, you'll tell her about the night you were brave enough to leave everything behind to give her a better life. You'll tell her about the storm? About being trapped in a subway station? About— Dominic stopped abruptly, his head turning toward the door. His entire body had gone rigid, alert in a way that made Grace's heart jump. "What is it?" she whispered. "Voices," he said quietly. "In the corridor. They're not rescue workers." Grace strained to listen. At first she heard nothing but the ambient sounds of water and the building settling. Then faintly she heard it too. Men's voices, speaking in low tones, accompanied by footsteps that echoed through the corridor. Dominic stood slowly, positioning himself between Grace and the door. His whole demeanor had changed. Gone was the vulnerable man sharing his grief and hopes. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous, the person he'd been before he decided to leave his old life behind. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, stay behind me." Grace's hands instinctively went to her belly, her pulse racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to wait for rescue crews, get out safely, go their separate ways. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The voices were getting closer. Grace could make out words now. Italian, spoken too quickly for her to understand even if she'd known the language. But the tone was clear. These men were searching for something. Or someone. Dominic pulled his phone from his pocket, typed something quickly with his thumb, then showed Grace the screen. "FBI knows I'm here. Help coming. Buy time." Grace nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as Dominic moved to stand directly in front of the door, his posture relaxed but ready. Whatever was about to happen, he was prepared for it. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. A knock, firm and deliberate. "Dominic, we know you're in there." The voice was male, American accented with an edge of impatience. "Your uncle is concerned. You missed your meeting." Dominic didn't answer immediately. Grace could see his mind working, calculating options and outcomes. Finally he spoke. "The station flooded. I took shelter. That's all." "With who?" the voice asked. "Our sources say you helped 2 people to safety, an old woman and a pregnant girl." "Where are they?" Grace's blood ran cold. They knew about her, which meant they'd been watching Dominic, tracking his movements, which meant this was no random check-in. This was an ambush. "The old woman left hours ago, found another way out," Dominic said smoothly. "The girl is in the break room sleeping. She's nobody, just someone who needed help. This has nothing to do with her. Then you won't mind if we come in, have a conversation, just to make sure everyone's on the same page." The doors locked from the inside. Station security protocol. A pause then. "Dominic, don't make this difficult. Your uncle just wants to talk. Make sure you're okay. Make sure you're still committed to the family." Grace heard the threat underlying the polite words. She looked at Dominic, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled into fists. He was trapped. If he opened the door, they'd know about Grace, might use her as leverage. If he didn't, they'd know something was wrong, that he was hiding something. And then, like a miracle, they heard other voices, authoritative, official. "This is the NYPD. This station is closed. All unauthorized personnel need to evacuate immediately." The men in the corridor went silent. Grace held her breath, praying that whoever had arrived would be enough to make them leave. "We're helping with the evacuation," one of the men called back. "Just checking the offices for stranded people. We've already cleared this level. Everyone has been evacuated. You need to leave now." There was a tense moment where anything could have happened. Then Grace heard footsteps retreating, the men moving away down the corridor. But one voice, quieter now, drifted back. "This isn't over, Dominic. Your uncle expects to see you. Soon." Then silence. Dominic stayed frozen in place for a full minute, listening. Finally he turned to Grace and she saw something in his eyes that terrified her. Not fear exactly, but resignation. The look of a man who'd just realized his time had run out. "They know," he said simply. "They know I'm trying to leave. They know I've betrayed them." Grace stood on shaking legs. "The police are here now, you can tell them." "Those weren't police," Dominic interrupted. "Those were FBI. My handlers. They're extracting me earlier than planned because my cover is blown." He looked at her and his eyes were full of regret. "I'm sorry, Grace, I never meant to put you in danger. I'm not in danger. They don't know anything about me. They know you exist. They know I helped you. That might be enough." Dominic moved to the door, listening again. "When the FBI comes back to get us out of here, stay close to me. Don't give them your real name. Tell them you're Jane Smith. You live in Manhattan. You don't know me." "Can you do that?" Grace nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. And Grace? Dominic turned back to her one more time. Thank you. For tonight. For reminding me why I'm doing this. Why it matters. Before Grace could respond, there was another knock at the door, different this time. 2 quick raps, then 3, then 1. A code. It's time, Dominic said. He opened the door to reveal 3 people in FBI windbreakers, all business and efficiency. Mr. Russo, we need to move you now, one of them said. The situation has escalated. They barely looked at Grace as they ushered Dominic out. He glanced back at her once, a look full of everything they couldn't say, and then he was gone, swept away by agents and emergency protocols. Grace stood alone in the office, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the break room, confused and disoriented. What's happening? Where did that nice man go? He's safe, Grace managed to say. We're all safe. They're evacuating us. But as another agent came to escort them to safety, as Grace climbed stairs and navigated corridors and finally emerged into the gray dawn of a post-storm New York City, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be safe again. She'd met a stranger in a subway station. She'd heard his secrets, shared her own, felt a connection that transcended logic. And now he was gone, disappeared into witness protection, while she was left to wonder if that night had been real or just a dream born of stress and fear. The city was waking up around her, damaged but resilient, already beginning to recover. And Grace, standing on a street corner with her hand on her belly, realized that she too would recover. She would go home, have her baby, build the life she dreamed of. But she would never forget the man named Dominic, or the night they spent trapped together, or the way he'd made her feel seen and valued when she'd felt invisible for so long. Some encounters, she realized, change you forever, and this was one of them. The morning air hit Grace's face like a slap, cold, damp, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. She stood at the top of the subway stairs, blinking in the gray dawn light, trying to process the fact that she was finally above ground, finally free from that underground tomb that had held her captive for nearly 12 hours. Times Square looked like a war zone. Water still pooled in the streets, mixing with debris, trash cans, broken umbrellas, pieces of storefront signs that had been torn away by the wind. Emergency vehicles lined the blocks, their lights painting the wet pavement in alternating red and blue. Workers in bright yellow vests were already beginning cleanup, shouting to each other over the sound of generators and pumps working to drain the flooded subway tunnels. Mrs. Patterson stood beside Grace, wrapped in an emergency blanket provided by the paramedics. The elderly woman looked exhausted but unharmed, and she kept patting Grace's arm as if to reassure herself that they were both really okay. "Where did that gentleman go?" Mrs. Patterson asked again. "The one who helped us?" I wanted to thank him properly. Grace scanned the chaos around them, but Dominic was nowhere to be seen. The FBI agents had whisked him away in the opposite direction, moving with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested they weren't taking any chances. He was gone, vanished into whatever protection protocol they had in place for informants whose covers had been blown. "I don't know," Grace said honestly. "I think he had somewhere important to be." A paramedic approached with a clipboard, asking routine questions about their health, whether they needed medical attention. Grace assured her that she and the baby were fine, though she accepted a bottle of water gratefully. Mrs. Patterson was more forthcoming, admitting to chest pains, and the paramedic immediately called for a stretcher. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing," Mrs. Patterson protested, but she allowed herself to be led toward an ambulance. Before she climbed in, she turned back to Grace. "You take care of yourself and that baby, dear. And if you see that nice man again, tell him Anna Patterson said thank you. Tell him he's a good soul, whatever troubles he might have." Grace promised she would, though she doubted she'd ever see Dominic Russo again. Mrs. Patterson was loaded into the ambulance, and Grace watched it pull away, lights flashing but no siren. Not an emergency, just a precaution. Another paramedic approached Grace, a young woman with kind eyes and purple-streaked hair. "Ma'am, we should check you and the baby just to be safe. You've been through a traumatic experience." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to just go home and sleep for a week, but she knew it was the sensible thing to do. She allowed herself to be led to a mobile medical unit parked near the subway entrance. Inside, it was warm and clean and brightly lit. Such a stark contrast to the dim, dusty office where she'd spent the night. The examination was thorough but quick. Blood pressure slightly elevated but not dangerous. Baby's heartbeat strong and steady. No signs of premature labor or distress. The paramedic recommended Grace follow up with her obstetrician within the next few days, but pronounced both mother and child healthy. "You're lucky," the paramedic said as she typed notes into a tablet. "Some people trapped in the flooding weren't as fortunate." "You said someone helped you to safety?" Grace hesitated, remembering Dominic's instructions. "Don't give them your real name. Tell them you don't know me." But these weren't the FBI agents who'd taken him away. These were just emergency workers doing their jobs. "Yes," Grace said carefully. "A man. He knew about the maintenance corridors, knew where it would be safe. He helped me and an elderly woman." "Did you get his name?" "The city will want to recognize people who helped during the emergency." Grace shook her head. "We didn't really exchange names. It all happened so fast. It was a lie, but it felt like the right lie. Whatever Dominic was doing with the FBI, wherever he was going, he didn't need Grace drawing attention to him. She owed him that much." The paramedic accepted this and moved on to other questions. When Grace was finally cleared to leave, she stepped out of the medical unit to find the sun breaking through the clouds, pale and tentative, but there. The storm had passed. Grace pulled out her phone, down to 18% battery now, and finally had a signal. Immediately, it began buzzing with missed calls and texts, all from Maya. Grace called her back and her friend answered on the first ring. "Grace, oh my God, Grace, I've been losing my mind. Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" The news showed footage of the subway flooding and I thought, "I'm okay." Grace interrupted gently. "We're both okay. I got trapped in the station, but I'm out now. I'm safe." Maya was crying, relief making her voice thick. "I'm coming to get you." "Where are you exactly?" Grace gave her location and promised to wait. As she ended the call, she noticed she had a voicemail from an unknown number. Her hands shook slightly as she played it. The voice was male, professional, clipped. "Ms. Chen, this is Agent Morrison with the FBI. We have you on record as being present in the Times Square station during the incident last night. We may need to speak with you regarding witness testimony. Please call this number at your earliest convenience." Grace deleted the voicemail immediately, her heart racing. She didn't want to be involved in whatever case they were building. She didn't want to testify about anything. She just wanted to go home, have her baby, and live her quiet life. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't that simple. Those men in the corridor had known about her. They'd seen her with Dominic. What if they decided she knew something? What if they came looking for her? "Stop," Grace told herself firmly. "You're spiraling. They have no reason to care about you. You were just someone Dominic helped during a flood, that's all." A familiar car pulled up to the curb. Maya's ancient Honda with the dented bumper and the air freshener that smelled like artificial pine. Maya jumped out and ran to Grace, wrapping her in a fierce hug that was made awkward by Grace's pregnant belly. "Don't ever scare me like that again," Maya said, pulling back to look at Grace's face. I was so scared." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and found herself crying. Not from fear or stress, but from the simple relief of having a friend who cared, someone who'd been worried about her, someone who came when she called. Maya drove Grace home, narrating the storm damage they passed, flooded basements, fallen trees, a car that had been abandoned in standing water. Maya's apartment building had lost power for 6 hours, but otherwise she'd weathered the storm fine. She kept glancing at Grace as she drove, as if to reassure herself that Grace was really there, really okay. "What happened down there?" Maya finally asked. "In the station? Were you alone the whole time?" Grace considered how much to tell her. Maya was a good friend, but she was also a talker, someone who shared stories at parties, who turned life into entertaining anecdotes. And Grace's story with Dominic felt too private, too significant to become party conversation. "There were a few of us," Grace said carefully. "We found a safe place to wait it out. It was scary, but everyone helped each other. That's it, really." Maya seemed to accept this simplified version. She launched into her own story about watching the news coverage, calling hospitals, even calling the police to see if Grace had been reported as injured or missing. Grace listened, grateful for the distraction, grateful not to have to talk about the way Dominic's hands had felt when he'd touched her belly, or the grief in his voice when he spoke about his daughter, or the fear in his eyes when those men had come to the door. When they reached Grace's apartment building in Queens, Maya insisted on walking her up. Grace's studio apartment looked exactly as she'd left it yesterday morning. Small, sparsely furnished, but clean and safe. The baby clothes she'd been folding were still on the bed. The lesson plans for next week were still spread across her tiny dining table. It felt surreal, stepping back into this life after the suspended reality of the night before. Maya made Grace tea and toast, fussing over her like a mother hen. "You should rest," she kept saying. "You've been through a trauma. You need to take care of yourself." Grace promised she would, and eventually Maya left reluctantly after making Grace swear to call if she needed anything. Alone finally, Grace sank onto her second-hand couch and let out a long breath. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Ms. Chen, this is important. Please contact us." Grace turned her phone off completely. She went to her bedroom and lay down, one hand on her belly, trying to process everything that had happened. The flood, the fear, Dominic's stories, the revelation about who he really was, the men in the corridor, the narrow escape, and underneath it all, the strange connection she'd felt with him, the way he'd seen her, really seen her, in a way that nobody had in years, the way his grief had echoed her own pain, the way his determination to change had inspired something in her, a belief that people could escape their pasts and build new futures. Grace pulled the thin chain from under her shirt, the necklace her mother had given her before she died when Grace was 16, a small silver pendant in the shape of a bird. Her mother had told her, "Birds know when it's time to fly. Trust your wings, baby girl." Grace had worn it every day since, but only recently had she understood what her mother meant. Sometimes you had to jump off the cliff and trust that you'd figure out how to fly on the way down. That's what she'd done when she left Jake. That's what Dominic was doing now, leaving his old life for witness protection. They were both birds, learning to fly. Grace must have dozed off because when she woke, the sun was high in the sky and someone was knocking on her door. She sat up groggily, momentarily disoriented. The knock came again, firm and insistent. Grace looked through the peephole and saw a man in a dark suit, FBI credentials already held up to the door. Her heart sank. "Ms. Chen? I'm Agent Morrison. I left you a voicemail. I just need a few minutes of your time." Grace considered pretending not to be home, but she knew that would only make things worse. She opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "I don't know anything," she said immediately. "I was just trying to get home from work. I don't know who anyone was or what anyone was doing there." Agent Morrison was in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen everything at least twice. "Ms. Chen, I'm not here to interrogate you. I'm here to make sure you're safe." "Why wouldn't I be safe?" "Because you spent 12 hours in close quarters with a federal witness and certain people know that." He paused, letting that sink in. "Can I come in? This conversation is better had in private." Reluctantly, Grace unhooked the chain and let him enter. He glanced around her small apartment, taking in the modest furnishings, the baby supplies stacked in the corner, the general sense of a life being carefully rebuilt. "You're not in trouble," he said, sensing her fear. "But I need to know. Did Dominic Russo tell you anything about his business, his associates, his plans?" "He told me he was in import-export," Grace said, which was technically true. "He told me he'd lost his daughter. He told me he was trying to start over. That's all." Agent Morrison studied her face, clearly trying to determine if she was lying. "He gave you something, didn't he? In the station?" Grace's mind raced. She hadn't told anyone about the envelope, hadn't even looked inside it yet. It was still in her coat pocket, wet and crumpled. "I don't know what you're talking about. Ms. Chen, if Dominic gave you money or information, we need to know. For your own protection." "He didn't give me anything," Grace lied, and she must have been convincing because Agent Morrison's shoulders relaxed slightly. "All right, but if anyone contacts you, anyone asking about last night, about Dominic, about anything, you call this number immediately." He handed her a business card. "Don't try to handle it yourself. These are dangerous people." Grace took the card, her hand trembling slightly. "Is he safe? Dominic?" Agent Morrison's expression softened a fraction. "He's in protective custody, that's all I can tell you." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, he asked about you. Wanted to make sure you got home safely." He seemed genuinely concerned. Something warm bloomed in Grace's chest, but she kept her face neutral. That was kind of him. After Agent Morrison left, Grace locked the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She went to her coat, still damp from yesterday's rain, and pulled out the envelope Dominic had given her. Inside was more cash than Grace had ever seen in one place. 50 $100 bills, $5,000 total, and beneath the money, a small piece of paper with a phone number written in neat, precise handwriting. No name, no message, just the number. Grace sat on her couch, staring at the money and the number, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to turn it over to the FBI, to cut all ties with Dominic and his world. But the money could change her life, pay for medical bills, buy baby supplies, give her a cushion of security she'd never had. And the phone number, that was a lifeline, a connection to someone who understood what it meant to run, to start over, to hope for redemption. Grace put the money in an envelope and hid it in her closet. She programmed the phone number into her phone under the contact name Emergency. Then she turned on her phone and sent a text to Maya. "I'm okay. Going to rest. Thank you for everything." Outside her window, New York City was recovering from the storm. Crews were working, people were rebuilding, life was going on. And Grace Chen, 7 months pregnant and more alone than she'd ever been, felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dominic had given her more than money. He'd given her his story, his vulnerability, his belief that people could change. And in doing so, he'd reminded her of her own strength, her own capacity for survival and growth. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter move. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "I promise." And for the first time in a long time, Grace believed it. 3 months had passed since the night of the storm, and Grace's life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Her belly had grown enormous. She was now full term at 39 weeks, and her daughter could arrive any day. The apartment that had once felt sparse now overflowed with baby supplies. A second-hand crib that Maya had helped her assemble, stacks of tiny clothes, diapers, bottles, and all the other essentials that came with preparing for a new life. Grace had used Dominic's money carefully and strategically. She'd paid off her outstanding medical bills, bought a quality car seat and stroller, and put the rest in a savings account for emergencies. Every time she looked at that account balance, she thought of him, wondered where he was, whether he was safe, whether he'd found the peace he'd been searching for. The FBI had called twice more in the weeks following the flood, but Grace had stuck to her story. She knew nothing. Dominic had simply helped her to safety. That was all. Eventually, they'd stopped calling. Whatever case they were building, apparently they didn't need her testimony. Grace had tried to forget that night, to compartmentalize it as just a strange experience during a crisis. But Dominic's face appeared in her dreams sometimes. The grief in his eyes when he spoke about Sophia. The wonder when he felt the baby kick. The fierce protectiveness when those men came to the door. She'd never used the phone number he'd given her. Part of her wanted to know if he was okay, wanted to tell him that she was managing, that his gift had made a real difference. But another part of her knew that any contact could be dangerous, for both of them. So the number remained in her phone, a secret connection she told no one about. It was a Thursday evening in late October when Grace's water broke. She just finished preparing dinner, a simple pasta dish that was one of the few things that didn't give her heartburn, when she felt the sudden gush of fluid. For a moment, she stood frozen in her tiny kitchen, staring down at the puddle on the floor, her brain struggling to process what was happening. Then the first contraction hit, and Grace's training from her prenatal classes kicked in. She needed to time them, needed to call her doctor, needed to get to the hospital. But first she needed help. Grace grabbed her phone and called Maya, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's time. My water just broke. Can you come?" Maya's response was immediate panic. "Oh my God. Okay, I'm coming. I'm leaving right now. Don't move. Don't do anything. I'll be there in 20 minutes. But as Grace ended the call, another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first. She breathed through it the way she'd been taught, counting slowly. When it passed, she realized something was wrong. The contractions were already close together, maybe 5 minutes apart. This was happening fast, much faster than her doctor had said it would for a first baby. Grace called her obstetrician's emergency line, and the doctor on call listened to her symptoms with growing concern. "You need to get to the hospital now," the doctor said. "Don't wait. If your friend can't get there in time, call an ambulance." Grace hung up and tried to stay calm, but fear was creeping in around the edges. She was going to have this baby, possibly very soon, and she was alone. What if something went wrong? What if she couldn't do this? Another contraction, this one accompanied by intense pressure. Grace grabbed the edge of the counter, breathing hard. When it passed, she looked at her phone, at the contact labeled Emergency, Dominic's number. No, she couldn't. He was in witness protection, probably in another state, living under a new identity. Even if he wanted to help, he couldn't. Calling him would be selfish, dangerous, stupid. Maya arrived 30 minutes later, which felt like an eternity. her hair wild and her eyes wide with panic. She took one look at Grace, pale and sweating and gripping the back of a chair, and immediately went into action mode. Hospital. Now, can you walk? Grace nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Together, they made it down the stairs and into Maya's car. The drive to Mount Sinai, Queens was a blur of streetlights and contractions, and Maya's running commentary about traffic and shortcuts and breathing techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos. They made it to the emergency entrance just as another massive contraction hit. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, and Grace was whisked through corridors and into a labor and delivery room, with the kind of efficiency that suggested the staff had done this thousands of times before. The next hours were a haze of pain and medical interventions and concerned faces. Grace's labor was progressing too quickly. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not. And then suddenly, there were complications. The baby's heart rate dropped. Grace heard terms like fetal distress and emergency C-section and felt her own fear spike into terror. "You're going to be fine," a nurse said, squeezing her hand. "We do this all the time. You and your baby are going to be just fine." But as they prepped her for surgery, as strangers in scrubs moved around her with urgent efficiency, Grace felt overwhelmingly alone. Maya had been sent to the waiting room. Grace was facing the most important moment of her life without anyone who truly knew her, without anyone who loved her unconditionally. She thought of her mother, dead 12 years now. She thought of Jake, the father who didn't even know his daughter was being born. And she thought, inexplicably, of Dominic, the stranger who'd spent one night with her and somehow understood her better than people she'd known for years. The anesthesiologist explained what was happening, and then Grace felt the strange numbness spreading through her lower body. A curtain went up, blocking her view of the surgery. She heard voices, calm and professional, discussing procedures she didn't understand. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, she heard it. A cry, small and indignant, and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," someone announced, and Grace started crying, relief and joy and exhaustion all flooding through her at once. They brought the baby to her briefly, a tiny, wrinkled, beautiful creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right into Grace's soul. Then the baby was taken to be cleaned and checked while the doctors finished the surgery. Grace woke in recovery, feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. Every part of her body ached and the incision site burned despite the pain medication. But none of that mattered because a nurse was wheeling a clear bassinet toward her bed, and inside was her daughter. "She's perfect," the nurse said, smiling. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, all her tests look great. "You did good, Mama." The nurse helped Grace hold the baby, showed her how to support the tiny head, how to position her for feeding. Grace stared down at her daughter's face and felt her entire world shift and realign around this small person. Everything she'd been through, leaving Jake, moving to New York, the fear and uncertainty and loneliness, all of it had been worth it to get to this moment. "Hi, baby girl," Grace whispered. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting to meet you." The baby made a small sound, and Grace's heart expanded in a way she hadn't known was possible. A soft knock at the door made Grace look up. She expected to see Maya or a nurse, but instead a man stood in the doorway. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a navy sweater, and had a beard now, along with glasses that changed the shape of his face. But Grace would have known those eyes anywhere. "Dominic?" she breathed, certain she must be hallucinating from the pain medication. He stepped into the room and Grace saw that he was real, solid, actually there. "I hope this is okay," he said quietly. "I heard you were here. I had to. I needed to make sure you were all right." "How did you know?" Grace asked, her mind spinning. "How are you even here?" Dominic moved closer, his eyes on the baby in Grace's arms. "I've been keeping watch, from a distance, just to make sure you were safe, that everything was okay. I knew your due date was coming up and I had someone monitoring hospital admissions." He looked almost embarrassed. "I know it sounds intrusive, but I couldn't just disappear and not know if you were all right." Grace should have been angry, should have felt violated that he'd been monitoring her, but instead she felt something else, a deep warmth, a sense that someone in this world actually cared what happened to her. "The FBI," Grace started. "They know I'm here. I got permission. I'm still in the program, I made them understand that I needed to check on you, that I owed you that much." Dominic was still looking at the baby, and Grace saw his eyes fill with tears. "She's beautiful, Grace. Absolutely beautiful. Do you want to hold her?" The words were out before Grace could think better of them. Dominic looked startled. I I haven't held a baby in 16 years. I might. You won't drop her, Grace said gently. Come here. Dominic washed his hands at the small sink, then approached the bed carefully, as if moving through a sacred space. Grace transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support her head, and watched as this man, this complicated, damaged man who'd done terrible things and was trying desperately to become someone better, cradled her newborn daughter with infinite gentleness. Tears streamed down Dominic's face unchecked. She's so small, he whispered. So perfect. What's her name? Grace had thought about this for months, had gone through dozens of possibilities. But sitting in that subway station, listening to Dominic talk about his daughter, she'd known what her baby's name needed to be. Sophia, Grace said softly. Sophia Maria Chen. Dominic's eyes snapped to hers, wide with shock and emotion. You can't. Grace, you don't have to. I want to, Grace interrupted. Your Sophia deserved to grow up and become amazing. She deserved to live and love, and maybe become a teacher like she dreamed. She didn't get that chance, but this Sophia will. And every time I say her name, I'll remember that night, and what you taught me about second chances. Dominic couldn't speak. He just stood there, holding baby Sophia, crying silently. Grace let him have the moment, understanding that this was something he needed, a connection to the daughter he'd lost, a way to honor her memory. Finally, Dominic carefully transferred Sophia back to Grace. He wiped his eyes and took a shaky breath. I don't deserve this. Your kindness, I mean. After everything I've done. Stop, Grace said firmly. You saved my life that night. You gave me money that changed everything for me and Sophia. You kept watch over us even though you didn't have to. That's who you are now, Dominic. Not who you were before. Now. Dominic nodded, still trying to compose himself. I've been working with a program, he said after a moment, for at-risk youth. Kids who might get pulled into organized crime. I counsel them, talk to them about the reality of that life, help them see there are other options. It's not much, but it's something. It's everything, Grace said. It's exactly what you should be doing. They talked for a while, Dominic sharing carefully edited details about his new life, Grace telling him about her final months of pregnancy, both of them marveling at the tiny person sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. Eventually, a nurse came in to check Grace's vitals and give her more pain medication. I should go, Dominic said, standing. Let you rest. Will I see you again? Grace asked, surprising herself with how much she hoped the answer would be yes. Dominic hesitated. Would you want that? I mean, is it safe? I don't want to put you and Sophia in danger. The FBI said you could come here. They must think it's safe enough. They think my former associates believe I'm dead, Dominic explained. There was a situation a few weeks after the flood. They found a body they believe was mine. My uncle held a funeral. As far as they're concerned, I'm gone. So you're free, Grace said. As free as I'll ever be. Dominic looked at Sophia again, his expression tender. I'd like to see you both again, if you're comfortable with it. Maybe I could be someone in Sophia's life, not replacing anyone, just someone who cares about her, about both of you. Grace thought about this carefully. It was unconventional, certainly. Letting a former mobster into her daughter's life could be seen as reckless. But Grace had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts said that Dominic Russo, whoever he'd been before, was now a man trying to do right, trying to build something good from the ashes of his past. I'd like that, Grace said. Sophia needs good people in her life, people who will love her and protect her and teach her what it means to be strong. I can do that, Dominic said softly. I promise I can do that. Before he left, Grace asked, will you be her godfather? I mean, officially? I know it's a lot to ask, but yes. The answer was immediate and absolute. Grace, I would be honored. Truly honored. After Dominic left, Maya finally burst into the room, having been held up by hospital security checks. She brought flowers and balloons and excited energy, cooing over Sophia and taking dozens of photos. Grace let her friend's enthusiasm wash over her, grateful for Maya's presence, but her mind still on Dominic's visit. That night, alone in her hospital room with Sophia sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed, Grace replayed the last 3 months in her mind. The storm, the subway station, the night that had changed everything. Meeting Dominic had been the universe's strange gift, a reminder that people could change, that hope existed even in the darkest places, that sometimes strangers became family in the most unexpected ways. Grace reached into the bassinet and gently touched Sophia's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled reflexively around her mother's finger, a grip that felt like an anchor, a promise, a beginning. "You're going to have such a good life," Grace whispered to her daughter. "You're going to be strong and brave and kind, and you're going to know that you're loved. So loved." 6 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, Grace pushed Sophia's stroller through Prospect Park. The baby was alert now, looking around at the world with curious dark eyes, reaching for leaves and birds and anything colorful that caught her attention. Dominic walked beside them, his transformation complete. He'd filled out slightly, looked healthier, happier. He worked full-time now with the youth outreach program, and had told Grace he was thinking about going back to school, maybe getting a degree in social work. "She's getting so big," Dominic said, leaning down to smile at Sophia. The baby kicked her legs excitedly at the sight of him. She'd grown to recognize him over the past months during his weekly visits. "She loves you," Grace observed. And it was true. Sophia lit up whenever Dominic arrived, reaching for him with chubby hands, babbling in her baby language. They found a bench overlooking the lake and sat together, watching ducks paddle across the water. Sophia fell asleep in her stroller, exhausted from all the excitement of the park. "I've been thinking," Dominic said carefully, "about my testimony. The trial is coming up soon, and I'm going to have to talk about everything I did, everything I was part of. It's going to be public record. Eventually, Sophia will be old enough to look it up to see what kind of person her godfather was." "Was," Grace emphasized. "Past tense. That's not who you are now, but it's part of my history, part of who I am." Grace turned to look at him. "When Sophia is old enough to understand, I'll tell her the truth. I'll tell her that you made mistakes, but you owned them, that you risked everything to do the right thing, that you spent your life trying to make amends and help others avoid the path you took. That's what matters, Dominic. Not the past you're running from, but the future you're building." Dominic was quiet for a long moment. "Do you ever regret it? That night in the subway, I mean. Do you ever wish you'd never met me?" Grace thought about this honestly. Meeting Dominic had complicated her life in some ways, had brought FBI agents to her door and made her look over her shoulder sometimes, wondering if his past would ever catch up with them. But it had also given her hope when she'd needed it most, had shown her what real strength looked like, had provided her daughter with a godfather who would do anything to protect her. "No," Grace said firmly. "I don't regret it. Not for a second." Dominic reached over and squeezed her hand, a gesture of gratitude and connection. They sat like that for a while, watching the ducks, feeling the spring sun warm their faces, both of them understanding that they'd found something rare and precious, a family built not from blood or romance but from shared pain and hope, and the belief that people deserved second chances. Sophia stirred in her stroller, making small sounds as she woke. Dominic immediately leaned down to check on her, speaking softly in Italian, words Grace didn't understand but that sounded like poetry, like love. Grace watched them together and felt her heart swell. This was her family, unconventional, complicated, but real. A single mother, a reformed criminal, and a baby named after the daughter who'd been lost too soon. They were all broken in their own ways, all trying to heal, but together, they were stronger than they'd ever been alone. As they walked back through the park toward home, Dominic carrying Sophia in his arms and Grace walking beside them, she thought about that night in the subway station, about water rising and lights flickering and the fear of being trapped, about a stranger who'd become the most important person in her life besides her daughter. Sometimes fate brought people together in the strangest ways. Sometimes hope really could be born in the darkest places. And sometimes the family you chose was stronger than the family you were born into. Grace looked at Dominic and Sophia, at this makeshift family they'd built from trauma and trust, and she smiled. They were going to be okay, all of them. They were already okay. And that, Grace thought, was more than enough. That was everything.